Good afternoon. I'm Vali Nasr, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and it is my great pleasure to welcome everybody to our forum today, and also in particular to welcome Representatives Ro Khanna and Walter Jones to this school for a discussion on U.S. foreign policy and potential for partisanship in forging it as part of our Dean's Forum lecture series. For 70 years, SAIS has served as a platform for policymakers and students to engage on crucial issues shaping world events. Today's event continues in that tradition of dialogue by bringing two congressional leaders together for a discussion on building bipartisan cooperation and debate in American foreign policy. Congressman Walter Jones has represented Eastern North Carolina in the House of Representatives for over 22 years. He currently sits on the House Armed Services Committee and is a proud advocate for our nation's veterans and active service members. Congressman Jones has co-sponsored more veterans legislation than any sitting member of Congress. He's also an advocate for shrinking the U.S. trade deficit, leveling the playing field for American workers, and curbing special interest in the election process. Congressman Ro Khanna is currently serving his first term representing Silicon Valley in California's 17th District. He sits on the Armed Services Committee along with Congressman Jones and also has a seat on the House Budget Committee. Also, like Congressman Jones, Congressman Khanna is a dedicated political reformer. Prior to serving in Congress, he received a law degree from Yale University and went on to teach economics at Stanford University and practiced law in Santa Clara and taught at Santa Clara University. Later, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce and wrote the book Entrepreneurial Nation. Though the two congressmen's approach to foreign policy are from opposite sides of the aisle, they have much in common. Today, we are fortunate to learn from their experience in governance, and we hope that today's event will spur further discussion of possible areas of collaboration in American foreign policy formulation. And as a school which has produced numerous professionals in foreign policy and security arena, I think their conversation will be very instructive for our students and alumni present here today. Please join me in welcoming Representatives Ro Khanna and Walter Jones to SAIS. Thank you.
Dean, thank you very much, and appreciate having this opportunity. My 10 or 12 minutes will be about Afghanistan. Congressman Khanna will be talking about another issue. I'll let him explain that at the time. First of all, I want to make mention of two things. I made a horrible mistake in voting to go into Iraq. I have Camp Lejeune Marine Base in my district, about 80,000 retired veterans. We were sold a bill of goods. I bought into the bill of goods, which I regret. I've signed well over 11,000 letters to families and extended families who've lost loved ones in both Iraq and Afghanistan. They posted to my right, your left. I have about 30 of these posters going back to my coming out against being in Iraq. This is just one of them. To me, for me, I'm not a great speaker, but to be on the floor of the House for a 5-minute speech talking about wanting to get out of Afghanistan, I take the posters beside me and they are picked up by C-SPAN. Many times the poster can do a better job of explaining my frustration of not having debates in Washington that I'll touch on in just a couple of minutes. Let me start on my frustration of Afghanistan. 5 years ago, I contacted the former Commandant of the Marine Corps, 31st Commandant is named Chuck Krulak. He agreed to be my unofficial advisor on Afghanistan. As the Dean says, I'm on the Armed Services Committee. When President Trump campaigned, he was an advocate of not staying in Afghanistan. Of course, we know from day to day he changes his mind. I won't get into that. But I want to share with you the letter that I wrote to him on July the 18th when he made the announcement that we would send more troops to Afghanistan. It'll take me a minute or two. Many of us in the United States House of Representatives believe we have been denied our sacred duty to debate and declare war. I'm going to skip around just very quickly. Sir, I'm writing you today because you seem to have changed of heart on this issue. One, in August of 2011, you agreed with Ron Paul and said the United States was wasting lives and money in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2012, you referred to Afghanistan as a complete waste and declared it was time to come home. 3, the next year you said on Twitter, do not allow our very stupid leaders to sign a deal that keeps us in Afghanistan through 2024 with all costs by USA. 4, you also tweeted that year, let's get out of Afghanistan. Our troops are being killed by the Afghanis we train, and we waste billions there. Nonsense, rebuild the United States of America. Mr. President, I agree with those remarks, and so does the 31st Commandant of the Marine Corps, my friend and unofficial advisor, General Chuck Krulak. As he said in a recent email to me, no one has ever conquered Afghanistan, and many have tried. We would join the list of nations that have tried and failed. My last sentence to President Trump, Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires. We do not want a tombstone to read United States of America. We have spent well over $1 trillion in Afghanistan. We've had over 2,300 Americans killed and 20,000 wounded. Why I share that with you, Congressman Khanna and myself, Democrat Khanna, Jones, Republican, we are very frustrated in the House of Representatives. Going back to John Boehner as the former Speaker of the House, letters in a bipartisan way, meaning Republican and Democrat, written letters asking that we have a debate on the future of Afghanistan. The last time we had a policy debate on Afghanistan was 2001. 2001, 17 years ago, and no debate. We wrote letters to John Boehner, and I even talked to him a couple of times, and it was always, well, you know, we're there now, we need to stay. Well, I don't buy that, but anyway, he did. We've written the same number of letters to Paul Ryan, asking him to please allow us to have a debate. John Garamendi from California and I put a bill in 5 months ago that all we're doing is asking for a debate. You can vote against us, but vote with us to get a debate. Then when the debate gets to the floor, you can vote against us. But this is a very frustrating time for those of us who believe that we have a constitutional duty to debate war. Madison said it best than anyone, and I'm going to paraphrase, that it's the legislative body, not the executive branch, the legislative body to debate and vote on war. I think the House of Representatives has, quite frankly, abdicated our responsibility. Whether the president be Democrat or Republican, we let the president make the decision. I don't think Madison or anyone else at that time intended for Congress to neuter itself by not being involved in our foreign policy. So a couple more points, and then I'm going to turn it over to the Dean again. For me personally, as I told you earlier, I have signed over 11,000 letters to families because of my mistake in Iraq. But now it's bled over into Afghanistan. We do not have any end point to the strategy. It just goes on, and the strategy is no one seems to know. The former President Gandhi of Afghanistan is now trying to bring the Russians back in to work with the Taliban to strengthen the Taliban with weapons and money so that the Russians can have more influence. Karzai, I said Gandhi, I'm sorry, Karzai, excuse me. Gandhi is the president now. But Karzai is now, in fact, tomorrow morning, Barbara Lee, she's a congresswoman from California, and myself join other members from both parties to ask for a classified briefing tomorrow morning on the role of the Russians coming back into Afghanistan. So it is a very frustrating time for those of us in Congress who believe sincerely that it is our responsibility to debate. I have been to Walter Reed, last point or two. Walter Reed, going back to 2003, I started going to Walter Reed at that time, it was in D.C., to look at the broken bodies. I thought for those of us like myself who did not serve during wartime, that it was the right thing to do to see the broken bodies and the families of those who were crying over the broken bodies. It has made a lasting impact on my life, and I can honestly tell you that's why I am so frustrated with the fact that we don't debate in Washington any longer. It is my hope that from this opportunity, I want to thank the dean and the school again for giving us this chance to speak, and we'll have a question and answer, and I'll be glad to answer any questions. But thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time to explain how I feel about Afghanistan, but also how I feel about the fact that as a member of Congress who takes the oath of office to uphold and support the Constitution, yet my right as a member of Congress is being denied by one man who's the Speaker of the House, who will not permit the House to have a policy debate on any of our foreign policies dealing with sending our young men and women to fight and die for this country. So with that, I've turned this back to the Dean, and I look forward to a question or two. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Nasr, for inviting us. Thank you, Congressman Jones, for your leadership. I was telling the congressman, I had a reporter call me a week and a half ago saying they wanted to do a profile on someone. And I said, who is the profile on? And they said, well, Congressman Jones. And I told the reporter that he is a voice of courage in the entire United States Congress. He has been willing to stand up for a debate and restraint in our foreign policy and stand up, whether it's to his own party or whether it is to outside forces, and I really admire his conviction and his independence. I got started in politics. I lost my first campaign, but it was the first anti-war primary, Iraq war primary in the nation in 2003. And I still believe that we need a restraint in our foreign policy, not just because of conditions of human rights, but because that is in America's national interest. And it's so important, in my view, to articulate a foreign policy that does not equate restraint with isolationism, that does not say that just because we are reluctant to use force in intervention, that somehow means that we're disengaging from the world or that we are not standing up for American values. Sometimes I wish every member of Congress would read John Quincy Adams. People in Congress don't write nearly as well. I mean, that's a high standard. But when people know the famous line from his passage about that we should not go out to seek monsters to destroy. But preceding that line, Quincy Adams talked about American values. And he talked about how America should be a voice for freedom and human rights around the world. But what he said is we ought to do that through our moral voice, through our prayers, through our encouragement, but we shouldn't go out sending our armies around those values. And the reason John Quincy Adams said that is he said because we wouldn't know who really the forces of liberty are around the world. And people get into wars, as he put it, because of envy, because of ambition, because of narrow interest. And while we should try to articulate a view of human rights and freedom, if we end up going and putting our armies in these foreign interventions, we will be seen as dictatorial forces, not as forces of liberty. And that is inconsistent with the very Republican ideals that we hold. That was the clarity and lucidity of John Quincy Adams' thinking. I agree with Congressman Jones on Afghanistan, but I wanted to apply that type of thinking to our role in Yemen. You have in Yemen a situation, first of all, one of the great humanitarian disasters in the world. Almost 1 million people facing possible cholera. There are huge numbers of people facing possible famine. And there are no people with clean hands. It's not that the Houthis are devoid of human rights abuses. But what we have is the Saudi regime systematically bombing Houthi and other Yemenis civilians in Yemen. And the United States is involved. We are assisting the Saudis with refueling those planes. We're assisting them with targeting the strikes in Yemen. Now, here's a question I have. I mean, if you actually go to my district or Congressman Jones's district and you ask people, ordinary folks, do you think that your tax dollars should be going to support the Saudi strike in Yemen? You know what most people say? What are you talking about? And then we have all of these experts and others saying this is in the United States' national interest. Well, you know why our founders were wise to give Congress the Article 1 decision on matters of war and peace? Because they believed in the collective wisdom of people to have a better sense of judgment on what is in America's interest than just people who are in the Beltway or experts. They thought, you know, if you really want to go to war, you should have to make the case to ordinary folks because they understand the stakes. Try to explain to someone. I mean, I challenge you as a thought experiment because all of you will be future leaders in the foreign policy establishment. Try to explain to someone who's making a living as a nurse or as a tech worker or as a firefighter that we need to spend their tax dollars and we need to put their kids' lives potentially at risk and we need to risk a backlash of terrorism to them because we have a strategic interest in making sure that the balance of power in Yemen between Iran and Saudi Arabia is maintained. I don't know a single person who will say, yes, sign me up for that the United States strategic interest is so important in this balance of power politics that I believe that that is correct. And what we have done by taking away the debate is disenfranchising the ordinary citizen, the common sense of ordinary people in what is in our interest. They suffer the backlash. They suffer the consequences of a generation in Yemen that is going to grow up believing that it was the U.S.'s funding or the U.S.'s support that led to the deaths of their relatives, all in the name of balance of power politics in the Middle East. I had a resolution that Congressman Jones was very, very thoughtful to co-sponsor, and Mark Pocan and a number of others, that it said something very simple, that we should not be providing assistance to the Saudis in bombing the Yemenis. It made it clear, look, if there are terrorists in Yemen that are threatening the United States, that our military can go after those terrorists in counterterrorism operations. We can debate that, but the resolution said we're not even going to touch that. But what we shouldn't do is intervene in the Yemeni civil war. That resolution, now we have bipartisan or support in the United States Senate, where you have Senator Lee, Senator Sanders, Senator Booker, Senator Durbin taking that up in the United States Senate. And there are 2 points I want to make on that. First, it showed me as a freshman member of Congress, folks said, well, you can't touch that kind of an issue. That's above your pay grade. But it shows you in the Congress you can make a difference if you have, especially if you have folks like Walter Jones and you have a bipartisan idea and you put it out there. And sometimes it may not be popular at first, but then we see now it's become a more mainstream issue with senators of both parties embracing it. So one of the things I would challenge all of you is don't be reluctant to start out as a dissenting voice. Over time, that may make a difference. The second point, I shared Congressman Jones's frustration when we introduced that. Because I said, let's just have a debate on the resolution. I said, you can, on the floor, you can tell me why I'm wrong. You can tell me why our strategic interest is to make sure that Iran doesn't become a stronger player in the region. That's the usual argument people give for supporting the Saudis. And I will make the argument why balance of power politics has gotten us into this mess, arming Saddam Hussein on the same theory, arming the Mujahideen on the same theory. And we can have that conversation. In fact, we should have that conversation. The American people deserve that kind of conversation. But they didn't bring it for a vote. Same reason they don't want to bring Congressman Jones and Barbara Lee's resolution on Afghanistan for a vote. There's only one reason they don't want to bring it for a vote. You know what that is? They know they will lose. They know they will lose the vote because the public sentiment in this country is so clear. Get us out of foreign interventions that aren't making us any safer. I believe fundamentally in the wisdom of the American people. They have been voting for people promising to get us out of foreign wars since Howard Dean, then Barack Obama, then Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. They keep saying, they keep voting for folks. Ron Paul had a tremendous amount of support. They keep saying, get us out of these wars. And then something happens. People get there and we're still in this mess. I look forward to the questions, but my view is let's restrain the hard power and let's lead more with our soft power, with the things that people love about this country, our technology, our innovation, our popular culture, our music, our art, sports. There's so much about America that we have to offer the world, so much we have to offer in terms of encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging innovation, being a beacon of a place where people have an open political system. I've often said I was fortunate to be born in the United States. My parents came here, immigrated from India. I said if I was born in India, I'd have less of a chance of making it to the parliament than being born Indian American, making it to the Congress. We have an incredible system. We have so much to offer the world in terms of our moral leadership, our economic leadership, our artistic leadership. That's where we should engage and lead the world, not engage in foreign interventions that aren't making us any safer and that are actually hurting our credibility around the world. So that is a conversation and debate I hope we can have, and I'm very grateful that we have people like Congressman Jones to have that conversation in a bipartisan way.
the middle that way. Well, thank you very much for your remarks that clearly made a very interesting case. And first of all, it's very wonderful to hear bipartisan voices around an important issue. And secondly, it's these days, particularly we're looking at headlines, there's very little focus on foreign policy, period, let alone wars. And it always almost is a question about how we can even get public focus on these issues. But I was particularly struck by a comment that both of you made about how difficult it is to actually get Congress, even internally, to debate these issues, which leads to two questions. One is that conceivably all the other congressmen, as well as the House leadership, also have constituents, and they should probably be hearing the same sentiments from their constituents. So why is there so few people like yourself in Congress pushing for this? And secondly, what is the motivation for the leadership, knowing that even though they know that they will lose the resolution or the vote, why are they so reluctant to actually open the debate in Congress? What's the vested interest in keeping this issue away? And maybe I'll go down one by one. Maybe you first, Congressman.
Dean, I've been here 22 years, which you acknowledged earlier. Too many times the policy debates do not happen or do happen because of the influence of money. Eisenhower said, beware of the military-industrial complex. I think if we could ever, and this might happen in Congressman Rohana's lifetime, but it would never happen in mine, there would be an alternative to the influence of money. That would have to be an alternative of some type of voluntary public financing. Now I'll go back to the point, and then I'll finish. The American people, because we don't have the draft anymore, are not as organized as they would be like during the Vietnam War. If we had the draft and more moms and dads were losing their child, like the little girl in the poster, with her thumb in her mouth, wondering, which I'm guessing this, why is her daddy in the casket? We don't have the, I was saying to the dean, I wish the students in this international study would do a poll for me personally of should we have a debate on staying in Afghanistan or coming home, that I would use in the Republican conference next week or the week after Easter, and say 900 students at a local university say we ought to have a debate. We don't have the influence of the media on this issue that we should, whether it be Yemen or Afghanistan. That's what we need.
I would say I agree with Congressman Jones about the role of money in politics, and I think there are two other reasons. One, after 9/11, which was such a trauma to this country, there was a genuine sense that we had to be tough, and we didn't want to allow for another attack on our homeland. And I think that made politicians and some of people reluctant to be seen as weak on terrorism. And there is, I think, a genuine fear when probably people go to the president, whoever the president is, and they say, Mr. President, we're your advisors, and if you pull out and there is, God forbid, another threat or another attack on the United States homeland, people are going to blame you. And so we have to figure out how do we have a message that is smart and strong in defending our country against terrorism, and make the case that that doesn't mean interventionism, and that you can be strong on terrorism without having to be engaged in these foreign wars. But I think that pressure and understandable sentiment of not being seen weak on terrorism is there. And then the second thing is, I think there is an ideology, both on the liberal side of humanitarian interventionism stretched out, or on the neoconservative side of this idea that America is going to promote democracy and make the world a place where it can have influence and have a unipolar world after the Cold War. And I think we were naive in the extension of NATO, where we thought at one point that Russia would become part of NATO. This was the thinking during one of the administrations. And I think we were naive in the ability of us to promote democracy through military force. And that ideology has to be challenged.
So, Dean, real quickly, to the point that I made and Congress Khanna made, go on opensecrets.com. If you've never been on that website, look and see how the money, you can look up my name or his name, or any other member of Congress, Rhino Pelosi, and look and see where the money is coming from. The military-industrial complex has a tremendous amount of influence up here. I don't mind the system we have per se, but when I see that certain policies get to the floor for debate and certain policies that should be on the floor for debate never get there.
So at least one way in which we have often thought about some of the issues you raised is that if problems cannot or should not be solved militarily through a heavy-handed intervention without an end in sight, that we should find ways to resolve them diplomatically. I mean, this school has trained generations of diplomats, people who focused on conflict resolution. And nowadays, one of the things that worries us is that what it looks like the weakening of the State Department, the lack of emphasis on the State Department. It's an open secret. I mean, we see it even with our own students here, that they are virtually discouraged from pursuing a career in foreign service by varieties of ways, messaging, unavailability of courses, etc. This imbalance is actually being exaggerated, that we're literally now being left only with one tool, which is military power to confront everything. Is there a way for Congress sort of to intervene on what is very palpable decline of diplomacy, diplomatic tradition, State Department in the current administration?
Well, I think, Dean, you're absolutely right. I mean, we as a country need to recognize the value of diplomacy, of statesmanship, understand that great political leadership is about solving crises through creativity, imagination, and a diplomatic approach. The easiest thing is to say, okay, we want a military solution. That's, people aren't remembered in history as just for saying use the military. And I think, unfortunately, in this country, there has been a devaluation of the role of diplomacy. I'll tell you two quick anecdotes. I was with my nephew, and he had the honor of meeting the French ambassador. And so I said, to my nephew, you're learning French. Why don't you try a few words? Maybe one day you can be the ambassador to France. And the ambassador started laughing. He said, you're telling him the wrong thing. He's got to become a billionaire and contribute to the presidential candidate. That's how he becomes the ambassador to France. Right? So it's this odd thing that we don't appoint people who actually understand the history of the region or the country. And to Congressman Jones's point, how much money has influenced even our diplomats overseas. And then second, and I don't mean this in a partisan comment, and I really trying to refrain from that. Whatever you think of the President Trump or his son-in-law, it's absurd to me that you would put the son-in-law in charge of Middle East peace. Forget where his biases may or may not lie. I mean, I wouldn't put myself in charge of Middle East peace, and I've served a term in Congress. There have got to be other people who understand that region. And so it's this devaluation of the skill of being a diplomat that is disheartening, and I think we have to reaffirm that as a choice of public service.
Dean, I'll be very quick. I agree with every word that Congressman Khanna just said, too many times that it starts at the top. And if you have a president that believes in being the people's president and rebuilding the inner workings of the government, I think it's going to take that, quite frankly. I don't think I'll still be on earth, but at some point in time, some person is going to see that we have allowed the strength of our inner working of the government to somewhat have a crack in it, and in some areas collapses. So I agree with this, your comments totally.
So with that, let me open the question, but also I want to encourage our students in particular to ask questions, since the congressman gave them a charge to have their voices heard in terms of the importance of debate. They're usually shy. Yes, first question. And please introduce yourself also.
I used to be here. I'm Dana Marsh with Transnational Strategy Group, and thank you for putting this together. And Ro, it's very nice to see you again. I'm sorry it was a little delayed, but it may be an observation and then a question deriving from that. My experience, I was a State Department White House official over in the international economic policy area. One of the areas that I think, along with everything else that has been discussed here, that needs to be focused in on is a reassessment of economic tools that the United States has had traditionally to promote foreign policy ends. In the past, it's been trade policy in one way, sanctions in a different way, foreign assistance. All of these things need to be reassessed. Clearly, trade agreements are not going to be sort of pursued the same way they were before. We have some changes with this new development finance institution that has bipartisan support in both chambers and the administration. Sanctions policies, I think, also need to be reevaluated about how effective they can be if the whole world is not working with us. So I guess based on sort of that, I wonder what both members here would say about their thoughts on the more effective use of the economic tools we have in the toolbox to promote bipartisan cooperation and reducing the need for a military solution.
I very much believe in the point you made and Congressman Khanna has made, is that it's too easy for us not to lay out a plan for the diplomatic side of how we deal with an issue. And I think that at this point, whether Mr. Trump is the right person or not, I don't know. But I'm somewhat disappointed that Secretary of State Tillerson seems too many times to not being willing to step out in front and suggest, whether they're doing it good or not, probably not, but suggest that I think he did on North Korea, which I praise him and Secretary Mattis, but at this point, I still think you've got to have the encouragement from the very top. I really do. To me, the economy of changing, like we've been trying to, I mean, when John Sopko testified, he's the Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, to Claire McCaskill, the senator from Missouri, that we spent $6 million to buy 9 goats. The goats came from Italy. They have a certain texture. Trying to get the farmers to go from the poppy fields to raising goats. And I don't know, I'm not putting that on this administration or, excuse me, the previous administration, but you've got to have a better plan than buying goats.
Dana, good to see you again. I agree that we should be using economic means to help enhance our values. We've done it before. I mean, it was the Marshall Plan that gave the voice to Germany and Japan, and we did it in a way far more respectfully, I would argue, than what China is doing, for example, in Africa, with predatory lending, with extraction. I mean, I fundamentally do believe by and large, being a great power, the United States has an aspiration, because of the decency of our people, to be a force for good in the world, to be a force where we don't seek to colonize, we don't seek to make states client states. We want to see them develop, and that at our best with the Marshall Plan, or at our best with encouraging partnerships with entrepreneurs, or encouraging investments in UNICEF or education, we try to do that. And I think we should learn from the best of our practices, which in my belief, because we are a democracy and are accountable to the sentiments of our public, will have a much different trajectory than I think, for example, China's economic strategies. And it seems to me just a missed opportunity that we're not doing that.
Questions? That gentleman.
Well, I think being here today, I want to thank John Hopkins and the Dean for giving us the chance to share with you our views. I think that the problem has been what you said, the lack of public interest, but also I mean, I don't mind telling you, I've talked to Jonathan Turley. I've talked to an attorney in California last week. I feel so passionate about members of Congress being denied their constitutional right. I'm not an attorney, this isn't an attorney, to see what we could do to use the Constitution to our benefit by saying we represent 700,000 people, that's about the average. I have a military base, that we are being denied a debate on war. And of course, every attorney that I've talked to, and more than those two, have always said, well, you probably have a difficult gaining standing, because we are supposed to be able to control the purse. That is a joke. Members of Congress can get up and rail against the spending in a budget bill like DOD that has $40 to $50 billion for OCO funds, which is a slush fund, and nobody knows where in the heck it's going. And yet, we are, members of Congress, I'm speaking for myself, are actually that frustrated that we feel that we are not meeting our constitutional responsibility to support the Constitution and the provision, that deals with war.
I agree with that. I admire your and Barbara Lee's efforts. I mean, Congressman Jones is being a little modest, but I would say that he and Barbara Lee and the entire United States Congress are the two members who have pushed the hardest to have a debate. And to your point, I do think you strike a good, you make a good observation about the reluctance of folks to want to cast a tough vote. And let me put this in, from my perspective, in context. I think the reason Hillary Clinton is not president is because she voted for the war in Iraq. That was a tough vote that for a lot of folks. People don't like often casting tough votes. You look before that, a lot of people didn't get to run for president because they didn't vote for the Gulf War. And you had Bill Clinton and say he was for it and Al Gore was for it, but a lot of people who didn't vote for that were eliminated from contention. Politicians usually don't like casting tough votes. And part of the abdication from Congress has been to deflect the tough decisions to the executive branch and people not wanting, particularly in swing districts or others, to have to take a stance on issues that are very complex. But my view is that's your first responsibility, and we ought to be taking these tough votes. We're not, I've already cast votes I'm sure that I regret. That's part of the job, but we should have the guts to take those calls and make those decisions.
Thank you. With a note of thanks to the panel and SAIS. My name is Akbar Khwaja. I'm a former World Bank official. Congressman, you mentioned that U.S. spent over $1 trillion in Afghanistan, and now a recent statement from Ashraf Ghani recognizing Taliban as a legitimate political party. Would you expand some comments on your future funding and next policy step? Thank you.
Well, to your point, when you get the Department of Defense budget bill, that's again where I think the federal courts have been wrong by saying, well, you control the purse. That's the biggest joke I've ever heard. The whole issue is, to your question, is that we have no accountability of the money we're spending in Afghanistan. I think I mentioned this in my comments. 3 members of Congress, Massey and Welch and myself, wrote a letter to John Sopko asking John Sopko to please, since they've been overseeing the money of taxpayers' money spent in Afghanistan, how much can you identify going to waste, fraud, and abuse? Is that 5% of $1 trillion, or is it 10%? We did get a letter back from his staffer that by June they would have that information for us, and we're going to share it with the American people as well as members of Congress. But the point is, very quickly, that this goes back to our frustration about debate. Every time that DOD bill gets to the floor, the chairman, the ranking member sometimes will not support it, Adam Smith or alike. But they'll say, well, how can you deny the military and their families a small 3% raise? So it's just a system that as long as you can politically blackmail members of Congress to vote for a bill that most of them would like to have a debate on Yemen or on Afghanistan, but they are forced to vote for it because of being politically blackmailed about not supporting the military families. That is what is so frustrating.
A comment or
We can take another question.
that young gentleman there?
Donald Keys. I'm a member. Thank you. I'm a member of the Masters of International Economics and Finance here at SAIS. And so my question is, we have bipartisan support to have debate over these issues. And my question is, is there any sort of bipartisan support for what to do after the debate? So say that something changes, that Speaker Ryan actually allows the debate to go forth. Is there any bipartisan support for the solutions after that?
Well, I could speak from my perspective. I've talked to quite a few Republicans who will say, look, this is the longest war in America's history. We increased our troops under a Democratic president, under President Obama, and the Taliban controls more of the area today than it did before the surge. There is no expert, maybe people in this room would disagree, who think that just putting 4,000 more troops there is going to accomplish anything. I mean, to give you a sense of perspective, India has about 100,000 troops on the border with Kashmir to take on about 3,000 people who they claim as terrorists. So this idea that 15,000 troops is going to defeat the Taliban is just living in a fantasy world. And I think you have people who are realists on the Republican side and perhaps progressives' human rights concerns on the liberal side saying this is just not in our national interest. And my view is we should get out, but I definitely think there's a consensus there that the current strategy is totally ineffective.
Well, I see if the Russians are coming back in, I don't know what we can do to control that as well. We're going to go to the war with Russia, of Afghanistan. I would hope not, but you never know. But the point I'm trying to make is Gandhi, who stole from the American taxpayers billions of dollars, now he is, I mentioned this earlier, now he's working with the Russians to enhance the Russians' ability to have closer relationships with the Taliban. To me, I just don't understand, and nothing we can do. That's why I mentioned to you about finding an attorney to sue, to make a statement in behalf of the military first and the American people and the Congress that we are not meeting our constitutional responsibility.
Well, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. Please join me in thanking Congressman Jones and Congressman Khanna for an excellent conversation.